Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Progressive Hour. I'm Jennifer Jones Austin, and I'm the moderator for this Progressive Hour. I am so honored, so privileged, so blessed that our Progressive National Baptist Convention president, Reverend Peoples, has blessed me with this opportunity, the opportunity to serve, the honor of serving as the moderator for this evening's conversation titled Our Fight for Equality and Equity, looking back at PNB's social justice legacy under its eighth president, William Augustus Jones Jr., to light a path forward. Perhaps known to some, obvious to others, and yet curious for still others, President Peoples blessed me with this opportunity, for I'm a child of William Augustus Jones Jr., and following in his footsteps, his big footsteps, I'm a leader of faith in the enduring fight for equality and equity throughout this nation. As children of Dr. Jones and my mother Natalie, my siblings, William III, Elsa, and Leslie, and I, were birthed into the Black church, into the PNBC, and into the movement, and we've never strayed. As a child of the church, a daughter of the movement, a lawyer and a policy influencer, God has nurtured me to have a profound understanding, a critical understanding of the link between race, poverty, law, and social policy here in America, and the role that religion has played. I serve as the CEO of the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, which is a leading faith rooted anti poverty social policy and advocacy organization. I'm the vice president of the board of the National Action Network, which was founded and is led by Reverend Al Sharpton, one of my father's sons in the ministry and in the movement. I'm the co host of Open Line, which is a weekly talk show centering on issues concerning the Black community. And I'm a weekly co host along Reverend Sharpton on his show, Keeping It Real with Reverend Al Sharpton. I also am blessed to serve as the chair of the New York City Racial Justice Commission, the first commission of its kind in the nation that has been charged with dismantling racism in the laws that govern all of New York City. And come this November, New Yorkers here in New York City are going to have the opportunity to vote to end structural racism in our city's laws. If you live in New York City or you have friends and family in New York City, make sure that they know and make sure that they get out and vote to bring an end to racism in government functioning. But most importantly, is that I'm a child of God who believes that we're all here on this earth living in this moment because we have purpose. And that purpose is to do kingdom's work. And that's why I'm so honored to moderate this evening's Progressive Hour, which, as I shared, is focused on our enduring fight as a people for equality and equity, and our convention's history in the social justice movement, particularly for purposes for tonight during the tenure of President Jones, as we as a people and members of the bodies of God's church, the Black church, and of a community committed to the social gospel have to determine our role and our responsibility in this moment and going forward. Our discussion tonight is going to include a review of Jones's seminal work, God in the Ghetto, which was first published by PNBC in 1979 and then re-released in 2021 by Judson Press under the title God in the Ghetto, A Prophetic Word Revisited. Joining in the discussion tonight are four distinguished pastors and faithful members of the PNBC, all of whom have a unique perspective to bring to the conversation. The first is Reverend Michael C. Harris, pastor of the Baptist Church, First Baptist Church of Passdown in Coatesville, Pennsylvania. He's the nephew in blood and in ministry of William Augustus Jones Jr., and I am sure that my dad and his uncle would be so proud of him and all the work that he's done for the PNBC and really excited about his candidacy for second vice president. The next person joining us is Reverend Dr. Robert Linden, senior pastor of Bethelite Baptist Church in Brooklyn, New York, and he is a son in the ministry of Dr. Jones. Thirdly, we have Reverend Dr. Tyrone Jones IV. He's not a family member, but he can claim it. I claim him. He's the pastor of First Baptist Church of Guilford in Columbus, Maryland, and he's a follower of Dad's preaching and teaching. And fourthly, we have Dr. Adolphus C. Lacey, senior pastor, my pastor of the Bethany Baptist Church of Brooklyn, New York, where Dr. Jones pastored for 43 years. Good evening to all of you. Glad that we're together. Are you guys with me?
Good evening.
Good evening. Good to be with all of you. So let's jump right in. And I feel like there's no better place to begin than by looking back to our beginning as a convention. And so, what I want to do is take a few seconds, a few minutes to have a Sankofa moment. We're all familiar with Sankofa. You know, it's what our Ghanaian ancestors taught us, that it's not taboo to fetch what is at risk of being left behind, to go back and get it, to take from the past what is good and bring it into the present to make progress in the future. So let's have a Sankofa moment. Let's look back at the beginning of the PNBC and our history as a convention from the start, our history in social justice. So the truth is, I'm getting up there in years and I'm probably older than every single one of us on this panel tonight, but that's all good. But none of us, even myself included, were around at the beginning of the convention. So, as is the case with a lot of history, our knowledge has been formed and informed by the stories that we've heard from people who were around, and some of it who heard it from the people who were around. Our knowledge of the history of the PNBC has been informed by those stories, as well as by the people who held the pen when recording what happened in that moment. So, let me tell you what I've heard. I've heard that we were birthed by a few who split from the National Baptist Convention. Some people say they were expelled from the National Baptist Convention. I've heard that there had been a, many years long dispute over leadership. I've heard that those who formed the PNBC wanted a new leader with a more assertive and action-oriented stance on the civil rights issues of the time. So I'm going to begin with you, Michael, because our family has been a part of the PNBC since its inception. What have you heard? Michael, I think maybe you're muted.
All right, here I am. I actually heard that our grandfather, Dr. William Augustus Jones Sr., whom your father was named after, was present at the initial meeting in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1961. And also your father, as a younger preacher, was present at the Zion Baptist Church in Cincinnati, Ohio, where Dr. L. Venture Booth gathered brethren from all across the country to address two specific matters. One, we knew that there was a problem with National Baptist USA honoring tenure. Dr. J.H. Jackson was the ongoing president, and there was a certain amount of years that he was supposed to be able to serve and then pass the torch. But he would always preach these soul-stirring sermons, which would cause the people to want to suspend the rules. And therefore, he would add another year to his presidency. And then one person by the name of Dr. Gardner Taylor said enough is enough and challenged the status quo. And that's when they had that big brawl back in 1960, which caused for certain brethren using what you heard to be expelled from the National Baptist USA. And also we know that the Progressive started because it became the denominational home for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We know that within the presidency of Dr. J.H. Jackson, he did not want to give room to the prophetic witness and voice of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and he sought to silence that message from being brought forth to the largest body of Black Baptist believers. And therefore, that's why also Dr. Booth opened the door not only for persons to gather due to the tenure issue, but also the lack of allowing Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to speak prophetically about the various things that were going on in society that affected Black people.
Wow. Well, now let me ask you this, and I want to ask all of you this. Do you feel that, I sometimes feel when I listen to the history of the PNBC that I'm just going to put it out here, and maybe it's a little controversial, that sometimes we maybe overemphasize the role of Dr. King. And look, maybe that's blasphemy in this moment, forgive me, right, but I think sometimes when we do that, we don't center on all of those other people who came together, so that we see this was not King's convention. This was the convention of the Black church and of church leaders and churches that were centered on social justice. Is that fair? Is that unfair?
Well, Jennifer, I would say, well, both. Uh, the story that I heard was that the Black Church, the National Baptist Convention, churches part of that convention, rejected Dr. Martin Luther King, his message. There's a story that he came to Dallas, Texas, and the preachers who was a part of National Baptist Convention met him at the airport and told him to get back on the plane and go back where he came from. I'm not sure if that story is true or not, but I don't think that we really understand just how his message was not embraced. You know, everybody's Martin Luther King Jr. fan. If you listen to history now, you would think that everybody was on his page, everybody was for him, and that wasn't true. And I think that's where progressive came in to give him a home, to give him a voice, a place of residence, as Garnet Taylor said, to express social justice concerns.
Yeah, I would also piggyback on Dr. Linden, what he has shared in there. And Jennifer, I would certainly thank you all for this opportunity and our president for giving us this opportunity. The interesting thing about me, I'm new to PNBC because by right of Bethany Baptist Church. Prior to that, I'm an NBC guy. So I always heard the story from the NBC side. Be able to see that, and particularly with the death that took place in Kansas City, that created the impetus for the expelling. But I will say what you have brought up is very, very true. It's not King's Convention. King had SCLC. If it was King's Convention, he would have served as president. He never did. It was a group of pastors that got together to, again, as Pastor Harris has shared with us, again, to deal with tenure, but more importantly, to deal with not only what King did with, but it really wasn't King. It was kind of like anti-J.H. Jackson. I mean, J.H. Jackson, let's be clear, J.H. Jackson was powerful and hated. and he ruled relentlessly. And so it took courage for these people to be able to come together to create a new convention, because J.H. Jackson wanted to destroy them and to see their fate, but they were more concerned about the community than about their own individuality. And that's the powerfulness of how it started with the message that I would add.
And, I think that is so important because, we have to appreciate that this was a collective endeavor, and we're not just kind of get behind one person, because sometimes when we do that as a people, then we're always looking to that one leader. And that's why I wanted to bring this on. Let's turn and let's talk about Bill Jones, William A. Jones's tenure as president of the PNBC. And, I'd like to think that if you knew Dr. Jones, then you knew long before he became PNBC president what his focus would be. Yeah, he'd been mentored by Dr. J. Pius Barber, the same professor and theologian that mentored Dr. King at Crozer Theological Seminary. And he was also mentored by his father, William Augustus Jones Sr., and his pastorate, my grandfather's pastorate, as Michael has alluded to, was centered on social justice. So before Dad even became PNBC president, he was already committed to and entrenched in the work of social justice, or more specifically, racial justice. We need to let people know that he served as president of the New York chapter of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference when Dr. King was president of the national body. Dad was national chair of the economic justice arm of the SCLC, Operation Breadbasket, when Dr. Abernathy was the president. In the 60s, he openly confronted the United States government about the Vietnam War, even before Dr. King did. And in the early 70s, he preached a sermon at the historical and prominent Riverside Church titled God the Revolutionary. Back in 1974, he preached this sermon where he said, God is deeply disturbed by those systems which crown the greedy and crush the needy. And God says to Isaiah and to us, inequity is under judgment. That arrangement will be changed. The valleys will be lifted by the leveling of the mountains. The crooked will be straightened. The rough places will be made smooth. God is revolutionary in his righteousness, forgive me. And those of us who are identified with God are called to assume God's revolutionary posture. We've been chosen not to court but confront, not to invite but indict, not to recite good history, but to proclaim good news, not to be popular, but to be prophetic. We've been called to suffer for his name's sake. Michael, I want you to help people hear some of his thinking about potentate. So if you would just play a clip.
When asked what is your position with respect to the Queensland government's action, I replied, quite frankly, saying it smacks of political tyranny. Other questions then came in rapid-fire succession. In the name of the God of justice, I dodged no questions. I responded with courage and with confidence. And then came that question which I knew would surely come. By what right do you come to Australia and speak out in such manner? That's the question that's always lifted up whenever prophets challenge potentates. It's a question that has precipitated serious discussion and heated debate throughout the history of the Christian church. Theologians have wrestled with it. Lay people have split over it. There were those within the church who assert with all of their strength that the gospel has no ethical implications in terms of the world's governmental structures. They lift up passages such as Paul's word to the Romans, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Another of their favorite texts is Jesus' admonition, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. But there are others among us who believe sincerely that the gospel speaks to every human situation, that no segment of existence is off limits to spiritual scrutiny. This is a holistic view of religious faith. Some of us make the claim that every soul should be subject unto the higher powers, but only insofar as the state's behavior coincides with the purposes of God.
You know, as I listened, and I couldn't help but think about how these were words that he spoke during his presidency. Tell me, Dr. Jones, Dr. Tyrone Jones, when you hear these words from Dr. William Jones, what are your thoughts?
My thoughts are that Dr. William Augustus Jones was grounded in biblical understanding of justice, and that he lived out that credo by his actions in life. One of the reasons why I went to Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School was because of your dad, and learning about the linkage between him and Leon Sullivan and how these two freedom fighters, not only in America, but across the diaspora of Africa and beyond. We're looking to champion causes based upon their biblical understanding of justice. And so, it's an awesome thing. He lived out that creed by way of what the Bible had to say about justice.
Yes, yes, indeed. We have pictures of him at the White House sitting across the table from President Carter and challenging him during the period of apartheid, challenging him on his stance or lack thereof on issues affecting, persons of a darker hue across the continents, and specifically Africa and here at home. And he was doing this during his tenure as president. Are you all familiar with this, or are there other stories or examples that you all can speak of how he was speaking to truth to princes and principalities?
Well, we know that he also spoke truth to power to the business sector. We know that he led protests against various entities. One in particular was the supermarket A&B, and how some of their practices were not just to African Americans. And he also spoke truth to power by empowering Blacks to move in such a place where they could empower themselves by having jobs and providing jobs for his congregants, in particular the Bethany Baptist Church, where he protests against the same A&P that ultimately is shut down, that they turned into a restaurant called Harvest Manor, which really empowered Blacks to understand that if you stand up, God will bless you with favor if you stand up for what's right. So I think that's one of the ways where we see the benefit of speaking truth to power, where it may not always be welcome. It may not even be welcomed in our own community. But as long as it's welcomed by God, that's all that matters. And I believe that's what Dr. Jones truly understood, that I'm not necessarily looking for the amens or the applause, even from some of my colleagues. But as long as I'm doing what God has told me to do, then God will be pleased and God will honor what I'm doing.
And I think to add to that, the term was 78 to 80. And so you're looking at that term from Carter into Reagan, and his power to, like right now, what people are speaking right now with Biden. It's like, you don't want to critique Biden because he's our friend. You don't want to critique him, but yet he could still speak truth to power to Carter, knowing that his numbers could hit Carter. I believe Iran-Contra's taking place, all of this stuff, but he was still hitting him on that apartheid issue with regarding South Africa, with Ronald Reagan looming ready to come forth. And that's the reality of speaking truth to power, knowing that there are consequences. And I believe he did that effectively.
I think that's such a powerful statement, especially, I'm just going to put it out here as, we look around the country and we have all people of different races and ethnicities in position of power. And we're hesitant, especially when one of us gets into a position of authority or power to question or to challenge. It's like, wait, no, you can't take on us because we may not have another chance. But if one of us is in a position of authority and not doing what is right, we need to take them on. And I think that, just as he did with Carter, he probably would be doing the same today. Is that fair?
That's fair. And I think also we need to look at Doc's confidence and courage. I think when the preaching clip said he was scared to answer no questions, and he answered them with confidence and courage. And I'm a living witness because I had the opportunity to be in his space, which means that we have been together many days as one of his staff members. And wherever he went, I was always amazed how people talked about the boycotts, the A&P store, the Operation Breadbasket. Wherever he went, they talked like it was yesterday. And I was like, Doc, he said, well, this was several years ago. I said, well, Doc, people talking like it was yesterday. Such a powerful impact that he made here on the community of Brooklyn. and in the 5 boroughs.
You know, one of the things that I remember reading as he was winding up his tenure as president of the PNBC and had during that time founded the National Black Pastors Conference, he was quoted in the New York Times of having said, just imagine if all of the churches across these Black churches across these United States of America united and, you know, and moved collectively on a particular issue, we could change this nation, we could change this world. I'm going to pick up where, you know, on your point, Dr. Linden, about, you know, all of you, the courage, the conviction, the confidence, because not only did he speak out, he wrote, he put it in writing how he felt about a lot of issues. He wasn't one of those people who, you know, might say, I didn't say that. I don't know where you heard that. And we didn't have social media back then. So, you know, like, you know, it wasn't the case that people were necessarily constantly like in his face with the camera. But he wasn't hesitant to also put it in writing. And in 1979, he published what has become what is now considered one of his most seminal bodies of work. He published the book, God in the Ghetto. And I'll tell you all that right now, I'm actually sitting in his home study, where I'm sure he spent many hours penning this seminal work. He published this book, God in the Ghetto, in 1979 while PNBC president. And let me just read to you what he said, and then I want to hear your thoughts about it. He wrote, when stripped to a state of nudity, the racist ascribes to God a posture of partiality predicated on pigmentation, and then assigns to men their permanent places under the sun on the basis of pigmentation. He went on and he wrote, summing up the state of Black Americans ever so succinctly, 116 years after slavery, it's actually today now 158 years, but he wrote in 1979, 116 years after slavery, Blacks have access without assets and freedom without finance, which is tantamount to existence without equity. When sin becomes structured and inequity institutionalized, the resultant arrangement is ineluctably wicked and nefarious, for it denies others access to the tree of life. This is the continuing tragedy of America. The system is racist to the core, so deep and pervasive in the reality that its bitter fruits multiply even without cultivation. Tell me, what do you all think of when you hear these quotes? What are your thoughts? I'll begin with you, Dr. Jones.
I think on the first hand of just hearing the words from God in the Ghetto written when Dr. Jones wrote it back in 1979 is that it could speak to us today. It's something that resonates across the chasm of years to today's time, where we're still in a place where we have access, but still not affluence, where we are people who are grappling and trying to make it and struggle, but yet and still not seen in a place of equality. And now, you know, we have DEI consultants and the like, and all of that's well and good. But when you look at the plight of African Americans today, you can see that we're still on the bottom of the rung. There have been some advances, tremendous advances, but the words of Dr. Jones still speak to us today, and how we have to make sure that we understand where we are. And then I love Dr. Jones because he didn't just talk about it. He was about it. He made sure that he did whatever he could in his own power to help advance the people, African American people. And I think that's important to note as well.
Absolutely. Dr. Lacey, what are your thoughts?
Yes, thank you. My thoughts that go back is actually hearing him channel the spirit of George Washington Carver, and being able to say is that when racism gets so ingrained in you, like I say, even if you don't build, even if there is not a back door, the Negro will know how to build a back door and go in there. So he's talking essentially about internalization that leads to externalization. So it's no longer policies. I mean, it's no longer people and programs. Really, it's the whole policies. So like people can sit back and say they're not racist. They don't have to be. The system is designed to be racist. So his critique, particularly when he talks about the three-eyed system of materialism, classism and racism, how those things they weave together. So you just can't you can look at the menu, but you can't order. So I really love that real critique of how deep it is, but then the critique of how deep it is serious, but most importantly, how shallow our victories are. That's what it says, that you're free, but you don't have finances. And so we know right now, to be free with no money, then you're not free. That's very serious.
Absolutely. Dr. Harris?
Well, thank you for that honorary doctorate, cuz I appreciate
It's on its way. It's on its way.
Just to piggyback up on some of the things that were shared, I like how Dr. Lacey talked about the system. And just as a point of correction, Dr. Lacey, the other part was capitalism, not classism.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you.
And the way he pinpoints those three things helps us understand why there is a need to fight the powers that be. Just reading God in the Ghetto and some of the things that he brought forth helps us answer the question why there's the need for the Black church. We understand that the universal church collectively, if we talk about multiculturalism, we know that there's a segment within the church that does not want to truly address racism in America, capitalism in America. And therefore, we're seeing this live and living color, how it's infiltrated the school system, where the school systems, public school systems in particular in various places, don't want to allow their children to become learned of critical race theory. So we see these things that Dr. Jones brings forth that holds true not only in the church when we talk about the system, but also in the school system and any other systems where white supremacy dominates.
Absolutely, absolutely. Reverend Linden?
So I'll just piggyback on Pastor Harris that he does a great job in defining the system. But the question, I think, will the church rise up to the challenge to confront the system? Do we have the courage? Do we have the confidence to lift our voices the way he lifted his voices to confront? He would confront anything he's seen wrong, any ill in society, no matter where he was not afraid to confront it. But I think that's where the question is, are we willing? Is the church willing to rise to the challenge?
And I want to unpack that a little bit more with you all in just a few minutes. I'm going to share with you, piggybacking on the comment, the remarks shared with us about the system that he spoke to, the system of militarism, capitalism, and racism. And I'm just going to say that I appreciated how Dr. Lacey was thinking classism, because actually what they've done in many ways is used classism to advance this capitalist, unjust capitalist society. But, when he wrote about this system, what got me was this appreciation that, going many, many years back when we've all thought that we've been fighting racism, what he helped us to appreciate was that that racism was and still today is just a tool. It's not the end in itself. And it's like playing checkers while they're playing chess. The end in itself, the end game, is to uphold an unjust capitalist society where some people have and others do not, and to use racism, a very effective tool, to decide who shall have and who shall not. And that's what he was helping us to do. One of the most often quoted statements from the book, even plagiarized statements, I'm just going to put it out here because I've seen it plagiarized in writing in books published by other people, is when Jones wrote at the very beginning of God in the Ghetto, a surface diagnosis of the system reveals a sick sociology based on a faulty anthropology which emanates from a false theology. This goes back to what we were talking about just a minute ago. And, Dr. Jones, you picked up on this right away, how this system essentially was founded in like religion.
Right.
Christianity.
Right.
The white man's Christianity. The white slave master who justified this racist society by determining that God was a racist.
Right.
That essentially God was like them. So God was a white being, right? A white male being. And so then if that's, if that's your theology, then anthropologically speaking, the white male is most like God.
Right.
Right? He's supreme.
Mm-hmm.
He's preeminent.
Right.
And then sociologically speaking, you order your society accordingly.
Mm-hmm.
And you justify white man on top and black man, dare I even say black woman on the bottom,
Mm-hmm.
which is why still today, the black woman is paid at a salary and an average daily income, daily wage, significantly less than the white man. 64 cents on the dollar for every dollar earned by a white man. Because in the white supremacist's eyes, he's on top, she's on the bottom, and God has ordained it so. When he wrote that, it just made everything make sense. Why even still today, we can have, as Dr. Lacey was speaking to, these unjust policies that seem on their face to be so obvious to most of us, yet they still hold, and the role that religion has played. So what I want to do right now is turn and talk for the remainder of our time together about the path forward. I want to talk about the role of the Black church and the role of the Black church leader in, what is proving to be ever increasing, ever challenging times. Like many of us say, that we haven't seen times like this. Maybe we go back to the civil rights movement, but the push to undo all of the good that resulted from the leaders and the work and the doers of that civil rights period. All of that seems like it's being, pulled back. And it's even worse because they're taking even some of their own with them. So I want to talk a little bit about how Dr. Jones talked about the role of the church and the role in particular of the Black church. He wrote in God in the Ghetto, in the midst of slavery, two separate and distinct views of God and human beings emerged. The master's view and the slave's view. The two were irreconcilable because of the oneness of God's will for God's creatures. Black religion and white religion were inherently antithetical. It was only natural that two separate churches, one white and one Black, would spring forth out of the rocky soil of human slavery. He went on to write, the Black church has been and still remains the connecting rod between Black history and Black hope. And because of its non-dependence on the larger society, it is free to be prophetic. It is the church of the oppressed, unlike the white church, which is the church of the oppressor. It is prophetic, unlike the white church, which is priestly. It has a free pulpit, unlike the white church, which has a restricted pulpit. It espouses activistic affliction, unlike the white church, which is apathetic. It is substance, unlike the white church, which is shadow. Reverend Harris, I want us now to listen to the words as Jones talks about the church and prophetic preaching, or the lack thereof.
I am fearful for the United States of America. I wonder if her moral resources are adequate for survival. For the longer she travels, the less she seems to learn. I'm troubled about this land. But my greatest dismay and my deepest anguish are precipitated by the involvement of the church in the present crises. My deepest fears, brothers and sisters, are for the organized church in America. I look on so many professing Christians and see so little power. And the church's main guilt is not her failure to practice what she preaches. That's not the church's main problem. Her main problem, I believe, is her failure to preach. For preaching involves encounter and confrontation and urgent proclamation. Preaching, the kerygma in the New Testament Greek, is an assault on every bastion of human pride with the sovereign demands of the gospel of Jesus Christ. I say to you that the church in the main is failing to preach because the church is almost inextricably bound up in the fabric of the state. There exists a dangerous accommodation, a kind of peaceful coexistence which renders the prophetic voice speechless. And whenever the church and the state embrace, the church is no longer free to preach the gospel.
My Lord.
All right. What does that bring to mind? I mean, what do you think when you hear these words? You know, you're engaged. Like it's in our respective bloods, it's in your blood. What do you hear? Because you're dealing with faith leaders here in New York City and around the country. We're seeing sometimes faith leaders who aren't really speaking up, but just kind of going along for the ride. What do you think when you hear these words?
I'll go. I think, Jennifer, it is an indictment on the Black church, where we have leaned more toward our priestly responsibility and less toward our prophetic responsibility. And there has to be a balance between the two. To do all of the priestly acts of the church is one thing that is necessary and needed, but to have no prophetic voice balancing those the priestly acts is dereliction of duty, in my estimation. And I think that's what Dr. Jones was saying in that clip. He was saying that as people of God, as ministers of the gospel, it is our responsibility to speak truth to power, to make sure that we lift up whatever social ills are going on in the world, and then help people to find a way, by way of the kerygma, the gospel, to know that God hears your cries and that God will help you through the situation that you're in. But we have to preach it. If we don't preach it, then we're at fault. And I think that's what I hear clearly in what Dr. Jones shared in that clip.
Amen. I'm going to come back to you, Dr. Lacey, right now, because as I was sharing just a minute ago, you are entrenched in the work right now. And, we're seeing across the city of New York and in other places that you'll have faith leaders sometimes who just want to kind of, in my estimation, I'm unqualified, my opinion, kind of go along to get along, just want to be close to power. And sometimes it seems to the, to the disadvantage of our communities. So when you hear these words, what does that spark for you, given the work that you're doing in this moment?
Well, thank you. I love that question. I guess you could see I was chipping at the bit to be able to respond. First of all, I love where I pastor, and I love Dr. Jones's his seminal work where he does talk about the priority of a theology that orders the rest of the society based upon your anthropology. And therefore, at the History Making Bethany Baptist Church, there is a Black Jesus. And so it's amazing that, and I've been to places, and I'm just careful, but in Jones's spirit, I can call him out. I go to Bridge 16th Street. I was just there, and their white Jesus is still there. It's like, wow, 16th Street in Birmingham. Yeah, I said it. And I'm proud of what I never had to fix. I never had to pay for money or go through an ad campaign to change that. And that took courage to be able to do that, to put the Black Jesus up in 1960s. We weren't hit with that. Let's be very, very clear about it. It took courage. It also took that courage where he critiqued Giuliani. I know you remember, so much so that David Dinkins kind of wanted to disassociate himself with that.
Right. He called Giuliani a fascist.
Yes, he
back
did.
in 1991. And now the rest of the nations, well, not everybody,
just catching up. And so that's the beauty of it, that he was an awesome orator, a great preacher, but he didn't care about the accolades. He cared about speaking truth to justice, which therefore just means how his message would always continue to expand. So even though we talked about the 3 prongs, I bet right now he would add others on, because that's what growth allows us to be able to do. And that's what he sees. But right now, we got fly-by-night people, like you said, that want to be close to power, want a politician to come visit them. And therefore, we ignore the prophetic job that ministers have been called to cry loud and spare not. And sometimes you're too busy focusing internally that you can't even focus on the community. And that's a blessing. So I'm not hurting on churches that sometimes that's their struggle. There are many churches that are real concerned about paying a light bill and getting a heat bill. And those of us who are free enough that you ain't got to worry about your light bill or heat bill, then you can begin to focus on feeding somebody, because you're not focused on feeding yourself. So I thank him for setting me up to be able to move in this way.
I appreciate what you're saying. And Dr. Linden, I'm going to come to you, because you were there and moving about with him when he was centering a lot on, he used to talk about, like taking money from the government to take care of community. And
Yes.
he was vehemently opposed to that. And his words were, essentially, you can't sit at Caesar's meat. I'm sorry, you can't sit at Caesar's table eating Caesar's meat.
And not abide by the king's rules.
You can't do it. Talk to us, Dr. Linden.
Yeah. I think to add on what Dr. Lacey, Dr. Jones, and Dr. Harris has said, that one of the challenges is that many preachers are not able to interpret the times in which we live. Progressive was so powerful because it spoke to the climate of the religious and social and political times of that time. And one of the challenges that many pastors, maybe they haven't been trained, maybe they have not been taught, maybe they just decided to ignore. Maybe they decided to go along with the times in which we live. But if we're going to be effective, we're going to have to raise our voice, especially for this younger generation. Because if they don't see the courage in us and the confidence in us, the younger generation will not follow the church leads. A good example is Roe versus Wade. Those who believe in the evangelical view of the gospel, they're happy that the law was changed. But what about us? We who are of the Black church, are we willing to lift our voice for the liberation of our young sisters? It doesn't mean that we're trying to take a moral stand here, but we do believe in health. We do believe that practices should be fair. And so I think those are the things, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's police reform. And we're very bad when something happens in this world. Everybody wants to march. Everybody has something to say. Everybody wants to carry a picket sign, but then it goes away after several months, and then nobody's talking about police reform anymore. No one is talking about, voting rights. And I think we have to have a passion and a burning. And I think that's what Dr. Jones had. That's what kept him going. That's what made him preach every Sunday, wherever he went, to every convention, whether it was Progressive National or if he was preaching the Southern Baptist Convention, because he ran in conservative circles also, for those of us who knew him. But he wasn't afraid, even in conservative circles, to stand up in front of a white convention and tell them what thus said the Lord when it came down to social justice and the liberation of our people.
Can I interject real quick?
Come on.
A contrast and a challenge, and going back to Dr. Jones' words. the contrast between going back to those who organized PNBC to many of the preachers today, those preachers back then did not seek to be popular. They became popular based upon what they preached. In today's age, many preachers are seeking to be popular based upon what they don't preach, and that's oftentimes not touching or preaching the social gospel. One of the challenges that we have now, and even it's going to be a challenge to get those prophetic voices into progressive, is this whole new movement of trying to be popular on social media. And we now have so many preachers who will probably sacrifice the prophetic voice, which oftentimes will sacrifice the upliftment of their own people because they care more about Facebook friends, Twitter and Instagram followers than lifting up the gospel of Jesus Christ.
You know,
Let me piggyback, Jennifer, just on that. From even in our convention, Progressive National Baptist Convention, I have no problems of writing resolutions. I don't have a problem with press conferences and all of that. I think that's all and well in itself. But we have to change, and we have to do more as far as leading our people. We have to do more than just meet and talking about how we're going to get out of debt, how we're going to pay bills, how we're going to pay salaries, how we're going to keep headquarters up. And I can say this. Michael can't say this because he's running for office, but I can say this, how we're going to do these things. You know, we have to be a voice again. And that's what, and Doc had a concern before, you know, when I was with him, that we was losing the voice, the voice that Progressive was founded on to go against the ills of society.
You know, as I listen to all of you, I'm reminded of a few things. The first being that he wrote and preached a sermon titled "Responsible Preaching," in which he began by saying Amos, the prophet Amos, was one of his favorite prophets, his most favorite prophet, because he spoke truth. His mantra was, freedom is the ability to say no to a lie, to veto an untruth. And he would often say that the preacher is the freest person on earth because the preacher's allegiance is to God, to Christ, and not to the flag. And I think that that's what we sometimes lose sight of, and that's what all of you are speaking about. We've got to close. We've got to close in just a few minutes, and we could sit here for hours. And I'm not just talking about centering on Dr. Jones and his work, but truth be told, the work that you all are carrying forward, that is very much in the spirit of the Progressive National Baptist Convention. And so perhaps we'll have more time to do that. But right now, what I want to do is just take a look at one more of Dr. Jones's preaching clips. And this one centers on our role individually and collectively.
There can be no peaceful coexistence between Christ and Caesar or between church and culture. For coexistence connotes equality, and no man and no system can equal the Christ of God. He fits no pigeonhole. He's too big and too holy to be tied down to any human system. He bursts them all asunder. And the church's mission is to the world, to every segment of society. We are called upon by God to plant the cross on every domestic heel. We weren't saved to be off to ourselves in some little corner, celebrating our own selfish concerns. We were not redeemed to be nice people apart from everybody else. The last time I looked at the marching orders, they read, "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." The church needs the vision of Paul, the ability to scrutinize systems and analyze governments and decipher those things that separate people from people. Paul made very clear the nature of the adversary when he declared that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. So I ask you a question as I bring this in. Do you know your place in this mad world order? Do you know your posture in the present cultural predicament? You're supposed to be what the Hebrews call a jareen, a resident alien. You're here, but the main you is located somewhere else. You're in the world, but not of the world. Come on now, you live here, but your home is on high. You're a resident here temporarily. You're here for the time being. Your citizenship is in another country. Yes! In a word, you're supposed to be a saint in Caesar's household. You tabernacled here, but your kingdom is not of this world. You love America, but your highest love is beyond the din and dither of these shores. You recognize the flag, but you glory in the cross.
I think that says it all. I think that says it all. I wish that we could go on for another hour at least, because I'm sitting here, I'm taking all of you in and your words, your prophetic words in this moment, and just appreciating all that you all are bringing, bring into the fight this moment. I'm thankful for your service and for your leadership, for your presence here this evening, and hope we have an opportunity to collectively come together again and just keep pressing forward, doing our work individually and collectively. I want to thank President P. This was his vision, and I'm just that I got to journey with the four of you and be a part of it. I want to thank my cousin Mike to produce this event. I want to thank Brooklyn College for providing the clips that we were able to view, and let everybody know that in just a little time, 1,100 recordings of Dr. Jones's sermons and interviews and lectures are going to be online and available to the public free of charge. And so, people told me you can go in and use them as references to, as one preacher once said, to prime the pump. So I hope you'll take advantage of that, and more will be coming. You can grab a copy of God in the Ghetto, A Prophetic Word Revisited. We're going to be at the convention next week. Looking forward to that, and the book will be available there. Not because I'm trying to promote it, but because of what's in it. I think we can all learn from it. But again, I want to thank our panelists for just a wonderful evening. And I hope that we all leave here inspired and feeling that we've been called to serve and to uplift the social gospel in the way that God intended. And we all walk away knowing that we are still here today because we have purpose and we've been saved to do kingdom's work. See you next week at the convention. God bless.